Hello, my name is James Robson. I'm the Victor and William Fung Director of the Harvard Asia Center, and I'd like to welcome everyone on this rather summery fall morning here on the East Coast, at least, to this morning's panel entitled The Future of Africa-China Engagement/Relations. This is sponsored by the Harvard University Asia Center and the Center for African Studies, and is co-sponsored by the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies at Harvard University. The Asia Center has been fortunate to be able to cooperate with the Center for African Studies through the Africa-Asia initiative. And after my first meeting with Emmanuel a few years ago, when I first assumed the directorship, I realized that our interests in exploring these topics indeed met perfectly somewhere midway over the Atlantic or the Indian Ocean, depending on what direction you were looking from. And the Asia Center has very much valued our cooperation with the Center for African Studies. And we very much look forward to continuing in this cooperative relationship going forward. So as part of this morning's event, first I will introduce Professor Emmanuel Akyeampong, and then he will introduce the panelist. I'd also like to thank Tenzin Nodup, the programs coordinator at the Asia Center, for all of his efforts in helping to organize this panel today. So Professor Emmanuel Akyeampong is the Oppenheimer Faculty Director at the Harvard University Center for African Studies, and he's also the Ellen Gurney Professor of History and of African and African American Studies at Harvard. He was appointed the Loeb Harvard College Professor in July of 2005 and is a Fellow of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences and a corresponding Fellow of the Royal Historical Society. He serves as the president of the African Broadcasting Corporation Foundation, a partnership of academic researchers, African broadcasters, and African producers dedicated to the production of development-oriented programs for broadcast on television, radio, and the internet. He is a co-founder and director of the International Institute for the Advanced Study of Cultures, Institutions, and Economic Enterprises based in Accra in Ghana. And he has served as chair of the Committee of African Studies at Harvard from 2002 to 2006. As many of you will know, he's authored many books and articles, including a volume entitled Drink, Power, and Cultural Change, A Social History of Alcohol in Ghana, and also Between the Sea and the Lagoon, an Eco-Social History of the Anlo of Southeastern Ghana. He along with Henry Louis Gates Jr., has edited the Dictionary of African Biography, which is in 6 volumes. His research interests are social history, comparative slavery in the African diaspora, environmental history, the history of disease and medicine, economic and business history. And he has also been an editor of the Journal of African History from 2006 to 2010. So please, I'd like to turn the microphone over to you, Emmanuel, and thank you very much for moderating this panel today. And I'm very much look forward to our presentations by our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. And I should have told you to go for the short version of the introduction, but thank you for this wonderful introduction. My name is Emmanuel Akyeampong. I'm a professor of history and of African and African American studies, and I direct the Center for African Studies at Harvard University. It is my honor to have these very distinguished panelists joining us from Shanghai and Oxford in the United Kingdom, and from North Carolina in the United States. And I'll be introducing them very shortly. The Africa-Asia Initiative, of which this is a part, is a collaboration between the Asia Center, the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies, the Center for African Studies, the Harvard Law School, and the ChinaAfrica Harvard Network at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. And it connects with scholars around the globe to identify key areas of inquiry and theoretical interventions about Africa and Asia. This collaboration has been critical in engaging in conversations, research, and understanding the partnerships in an ever-expanding landscape of trade and investments, bilateral cooperation, information and technology, healthcare, climate change, as well as the vast intercultural synergies between the Asian countries and Africa. Today's discussion in particular focuses on China. Since 2009, China's influence on the African continent has eclipsed that of any foreign nation as Africa's leading trade partner and lender. Indeed, China has become a global lender in the area of infrastructure, and over the past 18 years has provided grants or loans to the tune of about 843 billion to 165 countries. These significant developments have heightened the need and urgency for a deeper understanding of Africa's historic relations with China, which I believe will assume even greater importance in the years to come. Africa's relationship with China will be important in Africa's post-COVID-19 economic recovery and in Africa's response to the effects of climate change. This brings us to our theme for today's conversations, the future of Africa-China relations. The panel will discuss many questions, including but not limited to, how much do African countries benefit from their relationship with China? Who benefits more from the bilateral partnership in terms of lending, trade, security, and diplomacy? What have been the experiences of various African countries in their past and present relationships with China? How do ordinary citizens and non-government sectors in African societies view the relationship? And how do their perspectives influence the government's policy making? And how will COVID-19 impact these relations? Our distinguished panelists are uniquely placed to dive into these themes and share with us their perspectives on this relationship and what the future holds for Africa and China. So I really hope you will enjoy the discussion, and I want to thank the audience and the panelists for making this possible. So let me start by introducing Maria, Adele, Carrai, and they'll speak in the order I'm introducing them. So Maria is Assistant Professor of Global China Studies at NYU Shanghai. Her research explores the history of international law in East Asia and investigates how China's rise as a global power is shaping norms and redefining the international distribution of power. In light of the development of the Belt and Road Initiative, she's looking in particular at the economic, legal, and political repercussions of Chinese investments and economic management in Europe and Africa. Prior to joining NYU Shanghai, she was a recipient of a 3-year Marie Curie Fellowship at KU Leuven. She has held fellowships at the Italian Academy of Columbia University, Princeton, Harvard, China, and the World Program, the Max Weber Program of the European University Institute of Florence, and the New York University Law School. So welcome, Maria. Our second speaker or panelist will be Folashadé Soulé, a senior research associate at the Global Economic Governance Program at the Blavatnik School of Government, which is in Oxford. Her research areas focus on Africa-China relations, the study of agency in Africa's international relations, and the politics of South-South cooperation. She was a postdoctoral fellow at LSE and a former Oxford Princeton Global Leaders Fellow. Her research has been published in several peer-reviewed journals, among which are African Affairs, Global Governance, and International Affairs. Folashadé also teaches as a guest lecturer in politics and international relations at the University of Oxford in the Department of Politics and International Relations. As a policy-facing academic, she is the initiator of the Africa-China Negotiation Workshop Series, bringing together African negotiators and senior policymakers to exchange and build better negotiation practices when dealing with China. So welcome, Folashadé. And I turn to Lina Benabdallah, an assistant professor at Wake Forest University, my alma mater. She is the author of Shaping the Future of Power, Knowledge Production and Network Building in China-Africa Relations, which appeared in 2020. Her research has appeared in International Studies Quarterly, the Journal of International Relations and Development, Third World Quarterly, and African Studies Quarterly, as well as in policy-facing outlets such as the Washington Post Monkey Cage and in foreign policy. Dr. Benabdallah is also a Johns Hopkins University China-Africa Research Initiative Research Associate, so Carrai, a Senior Associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies Africa Program, and a contributing editor for Africa is a Country. Dr. Benabdallah earned her PhD in political science from the University of Florida in 2017 and has conducted fieldwork in Beijing, Addis Ababa, Nairobi, and Bamako, among other places. So welcome to our panelists. So before I turn it over to Maria to start us off, just a note for our audience. When the three panelists have finished speaking, we will turn to our Q&A. Please use the Q&A function to pose your questions, and then I will raise these with the speakers. If your question is directed to a particular speaker, you can let that be known, or I'll make it general to all speakers. So welcome to everyone. Maria.
Okay, so thank you so much for having me here today. I'm particularly excited to be in a panel with Lina and Folashadé, and I admire their work very much. And so I am more from a Chinese perspective. I'm more of a China scholar, and I've done, before the pandemic, some field work in Ethiopia and Kenya, looking at corporate social responsibility and how it was understood and applied by Chinese economic actors there when they finance true railroad mega projects. That's my tie kind of to Africa. But I start more from a Chinese perspective, and I think Folashadé probably will talk more about African States Agency, which is very important, but I'm not talking about that today. And so the topic of our roundtable today is the future of Africa-China engagement or relationship. And the relationship China has with the 53 African states with which it has official diplomatic ties is complex and not linear or unidirectional. So it's kind of hard to make generalization. But as a historian today, I want to talk a bit about the past of this engagement and what it can tell us about the present and future of China-Africa relations. I want to focus on the way, in particular, true historical events have been framed by China in the Chinese rhetoric as defining China-Africa relations in terms of win-win cooperation or South-South cooperation for the past decades. And so the first event that I will refer to is the mission of Gengar, this Chinese eunuch or admiral that went to Africa in the 15th century as part of his expedition. And this episode, this event, has been used by China today as an example of China friendship and goodwill that defines Africa-China relations. And then the second event I want to refer to is the Bandung Conference of 1955, that is also considered a key example of Afro-Asian solidarity, and that again China uses to frame currently its relationship with Africa. However, what I want to say is that not only the way history is described, perceived, and narrated is not completely accurate, but most importantly, that China today is different, and the current geopolitical and geoeconomic context has greatly evolved in this past year. And I really think that we need a new way to define this relationship that goes beyond South-South cooperation, win-win cooperation, or so forth, or that even if it's win-win, that it's really win-win. But we will talk about this in a second. And so let me first start with the Gengar story. So the Gengar story has been used to contrast the narrative about the new China scramble for Africa. And Admiral Gengar stands out as an illustrious predecessor of the maritime Silk Road, who through his expeditions in the 15th century introduced China to foreign peoples and established lasting bonds of mutual benefit, win-win cooperation in the current parlance. And Admiral Gengar's heroic narrative of maritime exploration have been used to solidify historical bonds between China and Africa, and in particular countries in the East Coast, where now there are actually archaeological expeditions that try to trace descendants from this expedition. And according to the official narrative from China, he negotiated trade deals with African leaders on equal terms without exploiting their resources. And so he was described as an envoy of peace and friendship. Gen is depicted as symbolizing China's openness to the world and its goodwill. However, there is evidence that Zhang also operated as an agent of Chinese expansionism. He was traveling with a fleet of 200 big and well-armed ships. And although there's no record that he used force, imagine what leaders of the small state might have thought when they see these fleets approaching. And already then we can see that there was an asymmetry of power. Nothing happened, but the asymmetry of power was already there. But what I want to emphasize is that the China of the 21st century is no longer the China of the Ming dynasty, and China is a global power. And we cannot rest assured about its behavior in the future, even if you consider this peaceful past that wasn't that peaceful. And also the current international context has greatly changed. And there are many motivations that make Africa important geopolitically and geoeconomically for China today. And beside the projection of its soft power, access to natural resources continue to be a very important motivation. Moreover, the idea that this win-win between China and African states is sometimes misplaced in today's situation. And African countries have benefited greatly by Chinese involved development finance, and China provided extremely valuable options for building basic infrastructure that were not offered by anybody else in the past decades. However, after 21 years of FOCAC summits, China is seen to benefit more from the relationship than its African partners. And just to give you an example, Africa has an annual trade deficit with China that is over $20 billion US. And although China is contributing to build industrial parks and developing larger scale manufacturing in Africa, this is pretty much absent in the African continent. And most African countries are still importing very expensive finished goods from China and exporting cheap raw material. So this is not really, it cannot really be defined as a win-win. And another big problem is a lack of transparency of all the deals for big projects that China has signed with with many African countries. And a recent data report shows how most of the Chinese contracts that they analyzed have much more far-reaching confidentiality clauses than most of other commercial loans. And so this is a problem because I think corruption does very well in the murkiness or in the lack of transparency of this agreements. And so let's now go to the Bandung part. So the current China-Africa relations have also been framed in terms of South-South solidarity or third worldism. And this is expression of the so-called Bandung spirit of Afro-Asian solidarity that emerged at the Bandung Conference in Indonesia in 1955. And this is characterized by an opposition to imperialism and a refusal of economic subordination and cultural suppression. And although the African states that participated at Bandung in 1955 were actually very few, China and these states, as well as other Asian states that participated, all have been victim to colonialism that violated their sovereignty and opposed Western imperialism. And this is pretty much at the core or still of Afro-Asian solidarity. And this is also as what has led China to promote the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence that basically support sovereign equality and non-interference. And were also the basis of the 10 principles for conducting international relations that were adopted at Bandung. And the idea of sovereign equality, so no matter the size, bigger or small of the country, has been emphasized since Zhou Enlai's historic 10 African countries visit at the end of 1963, through which he started this policy that emphasized the importance of regular high-level meetings. And this is something quite unique to China, that really, it doesn't matter how big you are, like, you know, we're all equal sovereign. And so there is this emphasis on this regular high-level diplomatic meeting that, for instance, America or not even European Union have with Africa. And China has also emphasized this idea of sovereignty. I think we can see it with the less amount of conditionalities that imposes in its loans. And also the notion of South-South solidarity can also be seen more recently in the disbursement of mask, medical equipment, and vaccine to African countries during the pandemic. And it is also a name, if you want, of this idea of solidarity that China signed the G20 debt service suspension initiative and suspended other debt repayments. However, one can ask whether we can still define this idea of Afro-Asian solidarity or Afro-Chinese solidarity in terms of third worldism. And what does it mean, third worldism, today? I think China is no longer really a third world country. I mean, especially given its all this investment that it invested like in Africa and other countries. And also the idea of sovereignty might be changing in the next year. What China perceives also as sovereignty, now that it has all its interests abroad, also in Africa, it has its own people, its own workers, its own investment. So even the notion that is the core of this Bandung spirit might evolve. And so Africa has become of more geopolitical and geoeconomic interest to China for many reasons, and I hope we get the chance to talk about that. And there is a strong history that ties together China to Africa. But I think that using that and misreading that as a guiding principle for today and the future of China-Africa relations would be a mistake. And I really think that there is a need to redefine and update the relationship and how it's called, how we qualify this relationship, especially after the pandemic. This could be a great moment. And I think perhaps the forthcoming FOCAC that is just 6 weeks away might be a good place to start. And I stop here. I hope we have more time for discussion.
Thank you very much, Maria. As a historian, you've raised interesting issues for me that I hope we can come back to during the Q&A. Let me turn to our second presenter, Folashadé.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me and for organizing this seminar. Just maybe to add to what Maria just said, I think it's important to it's really important to look at the evolution of Chinese engagement with Africa, but also the other way around, you know, for African engagement with China. And I'll get back to this. But we've seen over the past decades that China's impact and engagement with Africa goes beyond economic engagement in the resource and infrastructure sectors. And now there's growing engagement in security, in peacekeeping operations, environment, you know, public health. We've seen that with COVID, but also media relations and diaspora. And Lina will talk about this more deeply later. China has also become a strategic partner, I would say, for the African private sector. And so it's important to see that, or to include this element, the private sector as well, because beyond construction materials, you have a strong parts of the African private sectors that, let's say, African businessmen that supply textile, furniture, motorcycles, amongst others, from China, and for several reasons, right? Low costs, despite the transaction costs, a variety of quality from very low quality, entry level, to medium, to high, to premium quality of the goods purchased, speedy processing of visas in a context where getting visas from Schengen countries has become more difficult. So for supplies, China became some kind of a reflex for African private actors. And if you ask, some West African business actors, they would say that doing business with China has also contributed to the expansion of the African private sector, at least making more people getting into business by choosing to get involved in that. And I agree with some authors like Antoine Kennen, who say that that China has become an African business, actually. So I think it's also important to mention this dimension. What I would maybe, let's look at the perceptions as well, right? There are multiple perceptions. What are the perceptions of all these Chinese goods, of Chinese investments in Africa? What do Africans benefit from it? And I think it depends on whom you ask this question. Africa-China relations are largely government to government, meaning that African presidents, and by relations, I mean official relations, they are mostly led by government to government interactions. Next month, we will have the 8th edition of the forum on China-Africa cooperation, where you will have all these African presidents, ministers, senior policymakers that, when you ask them, they are more happy with the relationship than civil society actors, for instance, because according to them, China allows them to have access to infrastructure funding and also to deliver their electoral promises. Right, so that's important to look at it, from this African perspective, where China becomes a strategic partner for internal electoral dynamics, but also for political regime survival. If you look at two examples, for instance, in DRC, currently there's a renegotiation of the SICOMIN contracts, and let's say Tshisekedi will be running for a second term in 2023, so he will be in need of strong electoral arguments. And in many countries, major infrastructure projects are heavily politicized and used as a means to show results, tangible results. This idea, that China provides concrete cooperation, concrete projects. And so it's important to look at this also from the perspective of these African politicians who have to leave a legacy for themselves, especially ahead of elections. You have the same case in the Ghana-China Boxy deal. Where the deal was supposed to help Ghana fill the infrastructure gap, and so Nana Akufo is approaching towards the ends of his second term, and there's an urgent political incentive, to see that. To see positive results being presented. So I think if you ask government actors, you will receive those types of responses. But at the same time, there is also some criticism, because for many, not being too reliant on China for infrastructure has become a priority. There's this need for partner diversification. In Togo, for instance, the Togolese government has been voicing concern about the lack of technology transfer in some of the China-funded infrastructure projects. The former president of Guinea, Alpha Condé, has cautioned against relying on China too much for mining contracts. So there's this strategy of diversifying projects by reaching out to others, like South Korea, Turkey, Russia, but also re-engagement with traditional partners like the US and EU countries. so this idea of reducing dependency, that is currently a key priority, and also sometimes by pitching these traditional and non-traditional powers one against the other. And so how do more, let's say, popular opinions, and non-government sectors, how do they view Africa, China engagement? I would say NGOs are much more critical. They are more critical about the role of China, especially in terms of criticism against non-compliance with international norms, sometimes environment, construction norms, fiscal, labor, safety concerns. This, of course, varies from one project to another. And China, at least the Chinese government and Chinese contractors, have been taking into account progressively some of these concerns. So there has been also, it's important to look at, how they've handled the criticism over the past years and how this has transformed the relationship. In terms of popular perceptions, Afrobarometer does an excellent job at gathering all these all the surveys, all the popular opinion, and their latest surveys, the ones that they've carried, show that, well, China is still very popular in Africa, and that a majority of African citizens still consider China to be, a key. Let's say it has a positive influence, although this has been slipping compared to 2000. I think it's 2013, and currently, let's say there has been a drop in positive perceptions, while other partners have increased in terms of popularity, like Russia in some cases. But what is interesting to see is that it's the new questions that were asked, especially around debt. For instance, how do African citizens consider debt? And there have been some shifting perception here, where the Afrobarometer survey revealed that less than half of African citizens, 48%, actually are aware of Chinese loans or financial assistance to their country. And amongst those who said that they are aware of it, more than 77% were concerned about loan repayment, and a majority also thought that the government had borrowed too much. And it's interesting to see that this is the case in countries like Kenya, Angola, Ethiopia, where respectively 87%, 75%, 60% of citizens respectively were concerned about the debt burden. So there's this variation. I would say it's really important to look at different African actors. We were talking about this earlier on in a previous panel, how China is not a monolith, Africa is not a monolith. So it's important to look at who are we talking about when we discuss China Africa engagement. And maybe a few words on who benefits more from the bilateral partnership. I think Maria showed already the high asymmetries, and I think that that's a general pattern, and something that is becoming more of concern. And I look more specifically at the West African region, where you can see that the trade balance between West Africa and China is also highly asymmetric, with West African countries importing more from China than exporting. And when you look at the breakdown, you can see that countries like Ghana, Nigeria, they top the list, while other countries like the Gambia, Cape Verde, they benefit less from this trade relationship. There's also a strong asymmetry between Anglophone and Francophone countries. And so I think those topics will be on the table, on the table of the next FOCAC summit that will take place, as I said earlier, end November. So I think it's, in terms of the future of China-Africa or Africa-China engagement, there will be key concerns on how to rebalance a bit all these asymmetries, while taking into account the various perspectives that various African actors might have on this engagement with China. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Folashadé. Let's turn to Lina.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the invitation. I would like to basically start where Folashadé ended with talking a bit more about FOCAC. FOCAC, for our audience, is the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. I want to talk a little bit about it in terms of the forum diplomacy that has become sort of a defining characteristic of China-Africa relations, and also mention a bit more about some parts of FOCAC that are more interesting to me. And so FOCAC was launched in the year 2000. It has systematically been hosted alternating between China and an African country. So this year will be the 8th edition of it. And it is supposed to take place in Dakar end of November. And FOCAC has become like I said, kind of a trademark of Africa-China or China-Africa relations. It's not the first kind of multilateral summit, country plus continent summit. Japan, TCAD, Africa has preceded it, but it has also actually FOCAC inspired a lot of other similar summit forum diplomacy platforms. So in 2008 and after 2008, we have a proliferation of similar platforms with India Africa, Turkey Africa, Arab Africa Summit, Russia Africa, and the US Africa as well. So it is really an important part of the China Africa relationship platform in order to understand really how the relationship is, at least at that sort of level, of the official level, is formulated. So typically what happens at FOCAC is that after the meeting, there's a release of an agenda, and the agenda essentially tells us what on the next 3 years, what do we expect to see in terms of financial envelope pushed for, grants or concessional preferential loans, cooperation, development, investments, and other aspects of sort of the multilateral relations between China and Africa. What FOCAC also announces in the agenda, and what is really interesting to me, is a whole host of exchange programs, scholarships, and human development investments that are planned for the China-Africa relations. And typically when we are thinking about China's rise in influence and engagement in Africa, we are probably more familiar with stories and images of trade relations, infrastructure projects, energy cooperation, and so on. Different projects on infrastructure that are being recalled and put back into the spotlight for scrutiny as of late. But what we tend to not hear as much about is precisely sort of this other kind of soft kind of human capital investment or social capital investments that I think are extremely important to understand, both in terms of evaluating and understanding the picture of China-Africa relations today, and also moving into the future. And so that's kind of something that I do a lot in my research, is try to look beyond sort of the material attributes of power and the attributes of China's investments in Africa by kind of looking at this sort of people-to-people relations, the human capital development, through examining sort of these scholarship invitations, training opportunities, seminars, workshops, and so on for African elites, government officials, civil servants, teachers, journalists, and so on. So just to give a very brief overview of some of these investments, during the last FOCAC meeting, which was in 2018, the FOCAC Agenda announced that over the next 3 years that there will be 50,000 government scholarships. These would be basically funded by the Chinese government. There would be 50,000 training opportunities for seminars and workshops to train professionals. There's this program that was called training 1,000 high caliber professionals, setting up cooperations between higher education institutions, 20 on the African side and 20 on the Chinese side, short-term law enforcement training courses, Chinese language courses for law enforcement liaisons, and so on. So the list goes on. And it is interesting to me to look at this, because oftentimes, even when we hear about the trade, we hear sometimes about the trade deficit between Africa and China, and we hear about sort of the debt distress. But I think that there's also another dimension to this deficit, which is a knowledge gap, which is a knowledge deficit in this way, meaning that as much as we see these thousands and tens of thousands of opportunities for Africans to go to Chinese institutions, to attend Chinese universities, and to go on these seminars and trainings in China, these seminars are going to increase their knowledge of China, China's history, Chinese culture, Chinese understanding of various aspects of whether security, finance, or whatnot. The other way around still is very lacking. So we don't see Africans, for example, present opportunities for the African university to be the place for hosting same or similar numbers of students and civil servants and high-ranking officials from the Chinese side to go and to sort of engage in these people-to-people exchanges, engage in these exchanges of cultural understanding of Africa as in plural. I'm not using this in a singular way. But I think it's really important to contextualize a little bit and see what when we talk about these deficits, what all are we talking about? And I think, to me, it's very important to add sort of this idea of, when we talk about depending on, what all are we what do we mean by depending on? And I think moving forward, in terms of what we expect, or the trend, looking at various, which is something I do, looking at various FOCAC agendas to see how these trends are moving forward, we see there's always an increase in these numbers of exchanges and scholarships and people-to-people seminars and trainings from the Chinese side towards Africans. These trainings, as Folashadé said earlier, they're very popular among Africans. In all the interviews I've conducted, whether these trainings target civil servants or they target journalists or students, they're very popular. They serve a lot of purposes at once. From the Chinese side, they are very interesting, lucrative investments because they don't cost a lot of money. But they also are opportunities to bring all these Africans, delegations and trainees to go visit China. They are taken on tours. They go. There's a soft sort of power element there as well, when elites and civil servants from various African countries are sort of taken on these tours to visit various Chinese provinces and cities and facilities and be exposed to China's development model, see the success story of China's development model with their own eyes. So those impacts that are sort of these long-lasting impacts of these investments, of these tours, are they make this human capital investment very lucrative. And on the African side, they are very popular because of a lot of reasons. Sometimes you hear something that Folashadé made reference to earlier. So this idea that there are more difficulties now to get, for example, Schengen visas for African nationals. Oftentimes, same thing for accessing universities in the US or in Europe. But here in the relationship with China, there is a welcoming of, there is a trend that expands these opportunities and increases these opportunities. And that is something that is perceived to value the African partnership, to respect African participants. And that's something that creates this positive impression. among Africans about these training opportunities. I think sort of when we're evaluating or understanding who gets what and what Africans benefit from this relationship, I think, in my view, I always imagine what would it be like if these exchanges were sort of more symmetrical. What would it be like if some of these training opportunities were offered for, hosting delegations from China into Africa to basically create those same opportunities to understand the culture, to understand the environment, and to better know what these different communities want, how they view and perceive things. Because at the end of the day, I think that basically network connections are very important, and opportunities for trainings like these through the investments in human capital, they open up opportunities for norm making. They open up opportunities for African delegations to get to understand, for example, Chinese model of development, the Chinese model of governance, Chinese model of how the media and the civil society interacts, or the government and the media interacts. All of these are opportunities to really get to know China and to know China's various models of doing a lot of things. So they are extremely important, even though we don't necessarily talk a lot about them. And so I think that adding this to the perspective, what really we mean by trade imbalances and deficits, I think it really helps us understand basically a more sort of rounded image of China-Africa relations. Thank you.
Lina, thank you very much. You've all kept so punctually to time, and so we have good time. We have almost 30 minutes, and we have 3 questions in Q&A, so we're doing very well. So maybe as moderator, let me start with a follow-up question to each person, and then if Professor Robson also has a question, I think we have enough time to be able to do that, and also to fit the questions that have come in the Q&A. So let me start in the reverse order. So let me start with Lina. I was happy to hear you speaking about China's soft power. And it made me think of different ways in which other powers or other powers have portrayed soft power. So when I look across Africa and I think about Britain, something like the British Council and how the British Council is used come to mind. With France, it will be Alliance Française. With Germany, it's the Goethe Institute. With the US, it's USIS, United States Information Services, and all the kinds of roles. As I travel across Africa, I am beginning to see Confucius Institutes. And I was wondering whether you can, using the Confucius Institutes, maybe reflect about its place in China's vision of itself and its role in Africa. So that's for Lina. Let me go to Folashadé, and then I'll go to Maria, and then you can answer in that order. So I was very happy for Folashadé to point out not just the government-to-government relationships, but importantly for the private sector, that China has become an African business. And so there's a sense in which you sketch out the 3 key constituencies: government, private sector, maybe civil society or ordinary citizens or informed citizens. And then on the other side, you sort of clearly the relationship between China and African countries are asymmetrical. But if you could speak to, I'm looking for what would be the ideal balance that then positions African countries in a better place. So a balance internally between these 3 constituencies, but also, are we seeing other developed countries sort of stepping up in terms of their investments in Africa vis-a-vis China? If China is the only game in town, then there isn't much to choose from. But how do we sort of find a good balance between these internal forces and these external interests in ways that positions Africa better? And then to Maria, I was intrigued when you talked about the Chinese Armada in the early 15th century. There's a sense in which when that maritime exploration was going on, perhaps China was then the only superpower, at least in its part of the world. And so it could be gracious in not annexing the small places that it saw. And if you know, my colleague and friend Abdul Sharif points to that and points to how there was heterarchy in the Indian Ocean and not hierarchy, using that even as this particular example. But now we live in this era of global competition, and there's great power politics. And we've gone from, after the end of the Cold War, we had a unipolar world, and then China began to edge up, and we said we were in a contested bipolarity world. We don't know where we are going in the future, but there's a sense in which this competition defines how China sees itself and how it positions itself in terms of Africa and the kinds of roles Africa then plays for China. So I know we cannot look in an eyeglass and see the future, but we can see where things are heading with this global competition. How would this China-Africa relationship fare in what we see to be more pronounced global rivalry? So these are my three questions. And then and if my colleague James has a question, and then we'll open up to the Q&A from the chat box. Thank you.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Yeah, just very briefly, one of the things I've been thinking about just in terms of the larger picture here, even though we're really focused on China, Africa today, and Emmanuel brought up just, you know, the issue of big players in the region and everything, but also just keeping an eye on kind of geopolitical developments of relationships and between China and India as kind of positioning themselves vis-a-vis different countries. And I know that this past year that India sent representatives, and particularly has been trying to develop relationships with Kenya, I believe, is sort of the main player there. But I would love to just learn a little bit about where, you know, strategically how India might fit into this of what's going on there, of how China is trying to situate itself vis-a-vis another big, potentially big player in the region. But look forward to hearing your responses. Thank you. Thank you all for wonderful presentations, by the way.
Indeed. So you can respond to these questions, and then I will insert the questions from the Q&A.
Should I go? Or
please, in any order.
I can quickly respond to the question on Confucius Institute. Thank you for the question, Emmanuel. So it is very interesting to observe what you said earlier. There's a proliferation of Confucius Institutes across various universities and different cities in Africa. There seems to be an opposite trend of where Confucius Institutes are, at least in the last year to 18 months, have seen a trend of closure in the US, where several universities either ended their contracts with Confucius Institutes or have put into, you know, kind of investigations their contracts, not just in the US, also in Canada and several European countries. And so whereas the trend seems to be sort of where Confucius Institutes are facing challenges and investigations in this part of the world, in Africa, it's actually the trend is very much opposite. Confucius Institutes are becoming very popular, and they are opening up, in various universities. There was a conversation with the former Chinese ambassador to South Africa, Ambassador Tien Shui-jun, who essentially basically talked about Confucius Institutes as the business card of China. So they are really what you said about sort of how China's, how they represent China's vision of itself. They are definitely the business card of China. So they do bring about an understanding through culture, through language, through various programs of Chinese culture and history into various African countries to sort of, again, fill in that sort of language gap and culture knowledge gap of China. But Confucius Institutes in African countries do a lot more than that. They are more integrated with their communities where they are located. They are more aware, for example, of Chinese companies, doing work, let's say, for example, in Addis Ababa. Then you have the Confucius Institute trying to link up students of Chinese language to internships, possibly, available through the Chinese companies operating around in the region. They also promote and they will do a lot of cultural program promotions for students to go to China for scholarships and so on. So they are really integrated in multiple ways. They serve as the sort of a bridge between the student who's studying the language with an future employer, with the embassy, with sort of they also have a very strong network of connecting students to Chinese universities, but also other students in the African continent that are paired with the same Chinese university. And so it's a very strong network that creates all of these opportunities that plan on essentially aim at learning the Chinese language into almost kind of a tangible opportunity, that it's going to get the student somewhere. It's going to get either an internship or lend a scholarship or lend something that encourages studying the Chinese language and connecting it to essentially tangible material gains in a way. I think I'll be happy to talk more about the differences between Confucius Institutes in Africa and here if that comes up in the Q&A, but thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we turn to Folashadé. Maria, you ready?
Whatever. I'm ready, but I'm
Maria, please.
Yeah, whatever. So about rivalry, right? That China is it's shaping like its relations with Africa within this broader global competition, and it's certainly true. And actually, with the book that I wrote about sovereignty in China, it almost resembled this Darwinian thought, right? The struggle for survival and the fittest, like that is still there. So there is this very realist view of the international order for China. And that said, it opposes Cold War narratives, right? That are instead have been emphasized, for instance, by the US. So the rivalry is not framed through this US-China competition, and this is also something that Africans themselves don't want to fall. Like they don't want to fall into this trap between choosing sides of either China or the US. But it is truly a global competition, and you can see. I think one of the questions is also about US and Europe, how they're reacting to Chinese presence there, and also the Belt and Road. And you can see that, Africa was really marginal at some level, like from even European Union, like not many leaders, head of state went there, like there weren't very many meetings. Also with the Trump administration that used quite pejorative terms to describe Africa. And then all of a sudden, Africa got a new prominence, got to the center, right, in this global competition. And so now America is struggling to come up with an alternative to the BRI, to invest in infrastructures. And so we see with the Blue Dot Network before, to set new standards. And more recently, Biden tried with the G7 to launch the Build Back Better world. again, as an alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative. And the European Union as well has reshift focused to Africa. And so it's now trying to create a new strategy for Africa. And for China, yeah, it is definitely competition. But I think it tries to hide this competition, this very deep and kind of almost existential competition, under terms of community of shared destiny, these very peaceful terms that actually, I think, hide a more serious concern and preoccupation of China and its relationship with Africa. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Folashadé.
Yes, so the question about the balance to position Africa in a better place, and how are other powers reacting, and how can Africa benefit from this growing interest and find a good balance. I think those are very important and timely questions. I think that there's many ways, to position Africa in a better place, and I think first of all, it's and I think those discussions are actually underway. But if I look at it more from from key steps that are coming up in many debates and that I've also written on, I think it's first important in the different relationships that the continent or African governments have with with different partners, whether it's the US, China, and all. It's very important to avoid the zero-sum game, meaning that, this idea that African governments have to choose one partner over the other for geopolitical reasons that are not necessarily in, African governments' interests. I'm thinking about US-China rivalry and competition, for instance. But more importantly, it's about for African governments to follow a plan, a coherent plan. They all have national development plans, national strategic plans, and some countries are better at following a plan in terms of their foreign engagement, meaning if you take the example of Senegal, for instance, they have the Plan Émergent Sénégal, the Emerging Senegal plan, with all the different sectoral priorities. And there are several units within the government that are in charge of looking for specific partners, depending on the sector. So it's important to have this strategy of finding the right partner for a specific project instead of going with a take-it-all approach. You have several, just take everything that China offers, all these donations and all. It's important to assess whether it's necessary, whether it's in accordance with the national development plan, whether it's something that the country and its population needs. So that's a second element. The third one is to improve bureaucratic capabilities. There's this McKinsey project that highlighted the idea of having more China-capable bureaucracies, meaning within the government having more knowledge. And Lina mentioned this, the knowledge gap. There is a knowledge deficit on China. There's a knowledge deficit on understanding China, on understanding Chinese culture, on, in most of the negotiations that I've analyzed, the African side, many of the negotiators don't necessarily speak Mandarin. So, there are several of these tiny but very important elements that need to be addressed in order first to understand better the other, and then progressively rebalance the relationship by negotiating better on so many of these projects and clauses that, African officials sign. And just two others, it's important, and I wrote that in a recent paper, to reflect better societal concerns, meaning that all the preparations for the FOCAC summit, very often they tend to be between, regional organizations and presidents, ministers. But to what extent do they reflect some of the results from the Afrobarometer survey, for instance? Those are also elements that need to be taken into account, and to move up, it's way too top down for the moment. In terms of African coordination. And a final element that I would also say is just, coordinate better, exchange lesson, and move beyond just stratagems and moves and tactics and punctual, project by project ways of doing and building a more coherent strategy towards China. Many of these the continent China is Africa's first trade partner. So there is still a lack of a coherent strategy for engaging with China. It's still, a bit, it depends on the country, but I think there may be a stronger national for some, but also regional and continental strategy that includes all of the elements that I mentioned earlier.
We go to our chat. Q&A, and I'll ask 3 questions so that we have 3 from there, and if we are able to give very precise and brief answers, then I'll put some more questions in. So the first one is from Otobo, who is curious about what will happen at the next FOCAC and whether China may or will announce a new financial package for Africa in Dakar. If not, why? And then the second question is from Chu, who would like to know what have been the Western responses to China's initiative in Africa. And if somebody could speak more in terms of maybe EU or US responses. And then Veda and addresses this specifically to Folashadé about how important are civil society organizations that work at the grassroots in this China-Africa relationship. So let's start with those 3. So one about financial announcement in Dakar, 2 about the West's response to China's presence, and 3 about civil society organizations. And anyone can respond to any of these 3.
Well, Maria. Sorry.
No, go, Pasha. This time is
okay. Maria.
I can go on the Europe and US.
Yes. Why don't you do that, Maria?
Okay. Unless, and I'm sure you can also say more. That I think that, as I said, there's like US, the Western country, US and European Union started to think about strategies to balance China in Africa. And as I mentioned before, there is this Build Back Better World that was started by Biden, and its predecessor was the Blue Dot Network. The problem with this initiative is that they try to mock China investment in infrastructures, but I don't think there are valid alternatives, the one that are promoted also by Biden, because they try to rely on the private sector, but investment in infrastructure is very risky. And long-term return, like, you have to wait long-term before you have your return. And I don't see the private sector, the Western private sector for America coming in and investing in infrastructures in Africa. So I think they should probably rethink their kind of alternatives to China and the Belt and Road, and also try to send more high diplomats, like try to start from the diplomatic exchanges. And also the European Union launched last year this joint communication toward a comprehensive strategy with Africa, where it's also trying to kind of come up with its own its own plan for Africa. But again, I think the focus is very much on the private sector, and even China now is trying to bring in the private sector, because it's I think it's a with the evergreen case. I mean, it's also, there's less money that it can just send abroad. But that's my comment. Then I leave that space to the others.
Folashadé.
So about civil society and how civil society can exercise more agency and rebalance the relationship. I think that if you look on, there are several studies that show how in various contexts, in different countries, how civil society organizations, whether it's the environmental NGOs, human rights NGOs and so on, how they are very active in sometimes denouncing some of the Chinese practices that they consider to be not compliant with internal norms, domestic or international norms. So there's several, when you look, for instance, at civil society manifestations around environmental concerns in the Sierra Leone, in a project in Sierra Leone, or I think it's a fishery, but there are some environmental concerns. There's several examples. I think the question is, to what extent is this action or are all these various concerns integrated by African governments? It's not always the case that they are considered, but I've shown in some of my articles how there can be some, in order to rebalance things, often it's alliances. Alliances between civil society and in some countries where these things are existent, civil servants unions, bureaucratic unions, and mobilizing media, mobilizing the government in different ways, marches, riots. So there are examples where these types of contributions led by civil society have allowed for the negotiations or the project to be reconsidered in a way that is more positive or more advantageous for African populations. So, but it also depends on the nature of the political regime. In democracies, this is more feasible than in autocracies. I've compared Benin and Togo, for instance, in West Africa. Both have civil society organizations. They exercise agency in their various and different ways, but the nature of the regime allows for the Beninese civil society concerns to be more vocal or better voiced than in the case of Togo. So in the case of Togo, then they have to go and find out other strategies. So yes, it's really on a case-by-case basis, but there's a very active civil society on these concerns, and this is not China-specific. This, when you look at oil projects by Western countries, and you have the same problematics.
Lina, if you want to share some.
Yeah, I wanted to comment also briefly on the question of competition and rivalry. I think definitely some of the responses that that are important to look at are Western powers and countries and how they have viewed China-Africa relations, but also something that James mentioned earlier, for example, with the China-India rivalry and how that you go from sort of a BRICS kind of rhetoric where you promote a sense of cooperation between the BRICS countries, and then when you put that into sort of more or less the Indian Ocean and the geostrategic interests that are at play, then we see a different image of BRICS relationships there. And then China-India relations are more, they seem to be more sort of on a kind of a rivalry than really a cooperation when it comes to when it comes to the African continent, especially sort of East Africa and countries that are sort of more connected along sort of the Indian Ocean kind of concept. And I think that this brings up a very important observation, which is to say that any sort of competition and rivalry between China and any other power, whether it's in the Europe or whether it's in Asia or anywhere else, it kind of has the impact of creating kind of a negative environment within the African continent, because in a way just is always this sort of push and pull factors that can lead to negotiations that do not necessarily always get the best for the African population. And so I think it's important to really think about the context and the place of Africa and sort of this geopolitical structure. So yes, definitely engaging with China has increased a lot of Africa's sort of leverage and over other powers, because there's this, story that you can always say that there is an alternative, that there is an actor, a player that's serious about investing in African countries. But at the same time, the rise of China's power and the rise of China's influence also creates challenges in the way that it might lead other powers to feel threatened by China's presence, and such as India, such as other powers as well. So I think it definitely is a very, very, important question.
Thank you. More interesting questions appeared again in our Q&A, but we have gone past our time, and I want to respect people's time since we said we would close at 12:30. So let me turn to Professor Robson to close the session and to formally thank everybody. So James.
Great, thank you. First, thank you, Emmanuel, for moderating the panel and helping to organize this. But thank you to our three speakers today. This was really insightful and an engaging conversation that I've learned a lot from. So I'd just say that the Asia Center really treats this as a very important topic going forward, and we hope to be able to draw on you again and look forward to continuing our cooperation with the Center for African Studies and other scholars at Harvard and elsewhere working on these important connections between Asia and Africa, and China and Africa specifically. So thank you for taking the time to speak with us today, and thank all the audience who showed up today as well, and for posting so many interesting questions. Sorry we couldn't get to everything there, but I imagine that some of these will be able to be followed up with speakers or as well, or in the future. So thank you again, and we hope to see you at future events. Thanks a lot.